Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center's Board of Advisors, I'm pleased that you're able to join us this afternoon for the third in our Conversation on Philanthropy series. If you don't know, I'm Jim Ferris, and I direct the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC, as well as a member of the faculty. And we're delighted that you could join us this afternoon for this interesting conversation about philanthropy and foster care. We're thrilled to have Fred and Andrew join us for this conversation, and we hope, since so many of you are experts on the topic as well, that we have a lively interchange or conversation. So really, thank you for coming. Events like this would not be successful without the help of a lot of folks. I want to start by thanking the members of our host committee, Fred Ali, who chairs the Center's board, Wendy Guerin, a board member, Cara Esposito, a supporter of the Center and a former student, and Vicki Rogers, and Marilyn Wells. So let's thank them. We have some of our board members here today, and they provide great inspiration and guidance to Dean Knott and myself, and Antonio Manning, Lisa Parker, Doug Mancino, and Trent Stamp. Please give them a round of applause. And then the final thank yous go to the people that provide the support for the center that enable us not only to have events like this, but also to conduct the research we do on philanthropy and its impact on public problem solving. So let's give a round of applause to the partners that are listed on your program. So we're going to do this a little bit differently today for those that have been to our events in the past. We're not going to wait till after lunch to start the conversation. We're going to start while you're eating so that we can have a lively, robust conversation, enough time, and still get you on your way so there's something left of your day. And I'm really pleased, delighted, I don't know what the right word or adjectives are, to introduce my friend and colleague, Fred Ali, who is going to moderate today's session. I could give you a long introduction to Fred and his history from his days in Alaska to his leadership at the Covenant House, to the last 13 or 14 years, but who's counting, at the Weingart Foundation. The important thing for you to know that Fred agreed to do this right before he goes on a sabbatical. So Fred's gonna disappear for a few months starting October 1st, and we made sure that we got this in scheduling-wise before he left. But really, you know, I don't need to really introduce him, but Fred, I'm going to turn the program over to you. Thanks.
So good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And please enjoy your meal, because Andrew and I apparently aren't going to. We'll eat later. But I want to start off by setting the context for our discussion today with my friend and colleague Andrew Bridge. And you'll find me talking, probably referring, many of you probably know Andrew as Andrew. He and I have been talking for so long, I know Andrew as Andy. So you may hear me saying that from time to time. I know that many of you in this room have for a long time had an interest in, funded in the area of the child welfare area, and specifically foster care. And I think that all of us probably share a desire in common, and that is to certainly do what we can with limited private dollars to improve outcomes for children, youth, and families in the foster care system. So today we're going to talk about, what can be philanthropy's role in this entire area. I'm going to spend some time in the initial start of the presentation asking Andrew some questions, actually 3 questions. And then I'm going to open it up to the audience, so where I hope we can get some good dialogue. So as you think of questions, please jot them down, and there'll be plenty of time to get to those questions. We have prepared, I should say, Andrew prepared a glossary of terms that is on your table. And some of you are well familiar with these terms, but and Andrew and I have agreed that we're going to try to stay away from child care, foster care, child welfare speak, and not use a lot of jargon. But those are terms that you might find of interest and a good reference as we go along. So let me begin by introducing Andrew, telling you a little bit about his background. So Andrew lived on the streets of Los Angeles for a while with his mother, and at age 7 was removed from her by Los Angeles County officials. He spent 11 years in foster care, first in McLaren Hall and then in an individual foster home. He graduated from Wesleyan University and then Harvard Law School. He is a Fulbright Scholar and a University of California Regents Lecturer. Following a very brief stint in mergers and acquisitions legal work, very brief, Andrew began his career representing children in Alabama's public psychiatric hospitals, mental health facilities, and mental retardation centers. As many of you know, Andrew is also the former executive director of the Alliance for Children's Rights, headquartered here in Los Angeles. And actually, this is where Andy and I first got to know each other. We would spend time on the phone, especially when I needed help with a particular young person who we might have in our shelter at Covenant House. Came to Los Angeles to start the program for Covenant House, California, here in Los Angeles. At one point, I even asked Andrew to come over and talk to our staff, and it was a great afternoon. Where he certainly inspired them to keep doing the important work that they were doing. After Andrew left the Alliance, he went to work as the Managing Director of Child Welfare Programs at the Broad Foundation. Here he led the foundation's work. He led work to establish the Los Angeles County $1.3 billion Title IV waiver. Now there's a lot of stuff. The Title IV waiver of the Social Security Act, which remains the largest child welfare waiver in the United States and is the federal and state funding structure under which the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services operates today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, and there's some information on your cheat sheet if you want to refer to that about the Title IV waiver. In 2008, Andrew published a book, Hope's Boy. And this is a book, and we have copies here available for people who've not seen the book before. It's a memoir about his young mother's struggle with mental illness and his childhood, and Andrew's childhood in foster care. Hope's Boy, I'm happy to tell you, was a New York Times bestseller, a Washington Post Book of the Year, and an international seller published in 9 different languages. And I can tell you that many people have said to me it is the most moving and impactful story that they have ever read about foster care. So if you've not read the book, I urge you to do so. Andrew is currently working, in fact, I always give him a hard time, when are you going to be done? He's currently working on his second book, Headed Home, about his work representing a group of young boys in Alabama's largest mental hospital. So in 2008, the Weingart Foundation did something that, quite frankly, we had never done before. Given our long interest in funding in the area of foster care and various foster care initiatives we had supported, we decided to reach out to Andrew. Quite frankly, we weren't, as a funder, pleased with the outcomes that we were seeing, not only from our work, but the work of others in this area. So we reached out to Andrew, offered him a salary, a relatively modest operating budget, and a place to hang his hat. And I want to recognize Wendy Guerin, quite frankly, because her place became the place where Andrew hung his hat. Wendy stepped up on behalf of the Parsons Foundation and offered Andy some great space. So thank you for that, Wendy. It's really appreciated. In return, we asked Andrew to tell us how small investments of private funding might catalyze reforms in child welfare. We had no idea what to expect. We had confidence in Andrew's work, arguably one of the nation's experts in this area, and so we gave it a shot, and we have not been disappointed. Andrew, that initial step in 2008 led to the formation of the Child Welfare Initiative, and not too long ago, the Child Welfare Initiative was incorporated as a separate 501c3 organization, and Andrew currently serves as its executive director. So that's my introduction of Andrew and the Weingart Foundation's connection to Andrew's work. I want to now turn to my first question with Andrew, but I want to leave you with a couple quick facts that I think are important to keep in mind. In the 1997-1998 timeframe, there were 50,000 plus kids under the direct supervision of the Department of Children and Family Services within Los Angeles County, so 50,000 plus. Today, there are approximately 20,000 in direct foster care. So there have been big changes, as most people in this audience know, in this system. The point is that we now have a system that gives us hope for more flexibility and offers more opportunity. The point, though, is whether or not we take advantage of this point in time. And that's what we're here to discuss today. Private dollars are rather limited. Public dollars certainly dwarf those private dollars, but are there things that we can be doing in philanthropy that result in better outcomes for the kids and children and youth in the system and the families in the system? So with that, let me turn to my first question. So Andrew, you ready? So based on available data, between 2009 and 2011, foundations in the United States made over $100 million in grants to foster care projects. So $100 million between 2009 and 2011. Not as much, quite frankly, when I looked at the numbers as I might have expected, but nonetheless, that's what philanthropy was doing. To give that some context, in California, over $30 million in grants were made during that time period. And as I said before, though, the private dollars are significantly dwarfed by the public dollars. It's primarily through the Title IV of the Social Security Act. Public funding is approximately, for foster care, public funding is approximately $20 billion a year, just to provide some context. So the question is, despite all this money that's being spent, the outcomes that have been achieved remain questionable. By almost any measure, foster youth lag well behind their non-foster youth peers in terms of educational achievement, housing, and employment. So, Andrew, why is that the case, and what can be done about
Okay, we're leaving at 2, right?
Yep.
So, what I want to say is that I think when approaching that question, the temptation, and it's very easy, and certainly this, I've been guilty of this in the past, is to answer it harshly and negatively. I think it's very easy to begin to get into discussions about lazy bureaucrats and caseworkers who don't do their jobs. I think it's easy to get into discussions about foster parents who are in it for the money, who fundamentally don't care for the children who are placed in their care. I think that it's easy to begin to talk about the faults of service providers. And I think that all of those discussions and more very quickly lead you to a place where, one, you're set with a set of conclusions that in many respects fundamentally aren't true. They're not really reflective of the child welfare system, the people that work within that system, the families that are involved in that system, or the kids who are involved in that system. And I think beyond that, where it leaves you is with not a whole lot of places to go. And so I think it makes it very easy to walk away, to say that we can't do anything. And I suppose if there were anything, I would hope that by the end of our brief talk today, that folks, that you would realize that this is a system that we shouldn't walk away from, and that in fact we can do a great deal of help and good and improvement if we don't walk away from it. To answer your question as far as where these problems lie, I think that you can break it down on a larger scale on really sort of 3 areas. I think that the way programs are developed within these systems is highly problematic. I think that you have programs where you have individuals operating in an environment that's locked, that is in some way calcified, where you have individuals who are committed to a program. It's hard to see beyond that program, and in fact it's very risky to make changes to that program. As a result, I think what you end up with are programs that actually don't meet the individual needs of children. They serve more programmatic needs rather than those particular needs of kids. I think also if you take a look at some of the practices and the way practices develop within this system, they tend to be very incremental. And what they tend to be is, I was talking to Phil Browning the other day, the new director of DCFS, and he was pointing to me, one piece of paper was here on one policy, on a policy, and another piece of paper was over here that was on the exact same policy, and if you looked at them, they were in flat contradiction to them. There was really no way that you could reasonably reconcile them. And I think there is a commonality, though, that underlies that process and why you end up with this. And it's not just the fact that it's gone through piecemeal, but there's a development in those practices that goes to really principally 2 things. One is an overwhelming desire to reduce liability within this system. And the second that leads to that is the best way to reduce liability is to wring out as much risk as you possibly can from this system. Now that may sound good from a management standpoint, but the problem that you do is as you wring out more risk and more risk and more risk, you wring out more opportunity for kids. So for example, kids don't go out in foster care and have jobs. You've talked about employment. They don't largely have jobs because it's seen as being a highly risky adventure for them to go out as a 17-year-old and go working someplace. It's a danger to them, maybe danger to other folks who work in that community. I can go ahead and I can apply the overall framework within which we look at school and why it is that foster children don't participate in extracurricular activities or in sports or in the other programs that we see that they ought to be participating with, and that in fact go beyond just the daily activities of those and the individual joy and happiness that those may bring children, but the long-term results that they bring in terms of better outcomes after they leave care. And again, what you have are, for example, foster families that are fundamentally uncomfortable with going ahead and exposing the children in their care to those sorts of activities because they know that they'll face risk. They know that they may go ahead and be brought up by community care licensing or something along those facts. I think the other issue then finally is that you have, on the largest standpoint, issues of policy. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking about the manual that Phil pulled out for me. I'm talking about, these are largely at the regulatory and legal level, and these are laws, regulations, things that govern these departments that are often passed with the best intentioned, but are often terribly, terribly uninformed. They're often highly responsive to an individual event, so they often apply, they take an exception, they turn the exception into the norm, and so we have a system that is now, again, operating around a series of individual things that actually don't reflect the needs of the majority of children, but rather reflect what's gotten into the newspapers or what's gotten into them through other channels. I think the other issue that goes to that is that they're very poor at, and we know about this through a number of ways, and that is funding streams. They're very, very poor at going ahead and recognizing that the Department of Social Services and DCFS have a lot of clients in common, that in fact if you took a look at, for example, to go to employment, if you took a look at the employment programs that are offered under the Department of Social Services, you'd see that a lot of foster children are eligible for those programs. If you took a look at a grand jury report that came out in 2008, you'd see that there are literally millions and millions of dollars that are left on the table every year in Los Angeles County that could be accessed and could be used to get kids both pre-18 and post-18 jobs. So, and then I think overstretching all of that is a lack of understanding of the way these systems fundamentally operate. And that goes really to the first two issues. A lack of understanding on the part of legislators and regulators as to how social workers, how people who work within this department actually do respond to the needs of kids, and also how to meet those needs for kids. So I think that ultimately where that leads us is, well, what do you do? And what does philanthropy do? And I think that what philanthropy does so well is it is in a position that it's capable of providing a type of leadership and a degree of leadership that very, very few people are able to do. I think it's able to do that, frankly, in a way that very few nonprofits are able to do. It brings a sense of credibility and all sorts of things that other entities don't bring. And so it's about identifying particular areas from an outside perspective where you can show improvements into programs, practices, and policies. And by showing those improvements, you can show entities where, one, you can help them do their job better, which is what they want to do. And goes back to those strengths that I was talking about, where you have folks who fundamentally do want to do their jobs well, where there is quite a lot of money and where there's quite a lot of expertise. So it goes to that. And then also the second thing is that you want to be able to go ahead and identify where you can infuse those dollars on a temporary basis so that you're able to access or catalyze sustainable change. And we can do that in today's environment. We can do that, for example, when I talked about employment. The fact that there are millions of dollars sitting in county pots out there, they're ready to be accessed. The problem is that when you talk to the agencies, they just don't know how to work together and how to access those in a way that's going to be meaningful. So I guess what I might do is just use a historical example that I think has been especially effective. And maybe I'll start with an experience in my own life. When I was 17 years old, in the winter of my senior year, my social worker came to talk with me. This was her annual visit. I didn't know who she was. She actually came up to me about a year and a half ago and told me she was my last social worker, and I had to politely thank her and pretend that I remembered her better than I did. But in any event, she was a lovely lady. In any event, she sat down with me in the bedroom of my foster parents' house in the winter of my senior year, and she said, "So, you're leaving soon. What are you going to do?" So I guess we consider this sort of the Paleolithic efforts of transitional planning and foster care. And she said, she stared for an answer. And I looked back at her and I ticked off a series of schools that I had applied to. They were all on the East Coast. They were, I'll just say the way I approached it at that age, fancy places. They were places that I'd never visited. I knew them from the back of, Barron's Guide to Colleges. And I knew them from kids who talked about them in school. I didn't know about them from my foster family. I certainly didn't know about them from their biological children because they didn't go to school. And that worker listened, and after I was done, she said, you know, that sounds very good, but don't you think you should stay home? And don't you think it would be better to be closer? And don't you think that rather than going to schools like that, that you might find a local place? And she recommended a community college. Now, community colleges are great places, but it wasn't a particularly great fit for me. Now, when I look back at that, that woman, that social worker, did not mean to hurt that 17-year-old boy. She did, but she didn't mean to. And I think that what she was doing is she was reflecting what she knew and what she didn't know. In part, what she knew is she knew that kids who left child welfare did very, very poorly. She knew that probably because she got calls from kids who'd been on her caseloads. She knew that because she'd heard it from other social workers. She knew that because you could just drive down far enough down Santa Monica Boulevard till you hit Western and you'd see them on the streets. She knew that. What she didn't know was that you could do something about it. And it took a while for that to take effect. And pulling that forward, eventually, in the mid-90s, it was actually Philanthropy that took that up, that identified that need in a way that wasn't threatening, identified that need in a way that could be supported, and said, you know what, Department of Children and Family Services, you have a real need for housing for these kids. Because when we look at rates of homelessness, they're between 50 to upwards of 75%. And we're not really sure entirely, but they're certainly no better than 50. You need to build places for these kids to live. And that grant came from the Weingart Foundation. It was one of the very largest grants of its time. It was one of the very first grants to go to this area. And what that did is it didn't produce an ongoing program that required ongoing support from the Weingart Foundation or from the philanthropic community. What it did is it catalyzed an overall change that led to a whole series of reforms in policy and in practice at all levels of government. So the county government, the state government, and the federal government. And eventually that led to the passage of the Chafee Act, which went to go ahead and support, that's on the cheat sheet, but went to go ahead and support transition age youth and provide better services for them. It went to providing greater public dollars to produce more of those apartments and more of scattered sites and buildings for those kids. And that would not have been possible without philanthropy. And in that way, I think philanthropy worked in one of its best ways. It identified a problem, it identified a need, it provided the dollars that was needed to go ahead and catalyze and meet that need, and then in large part it was able to walk away.
So Andrew, and I didn't know you were going to mention the Weingart Foundation, but thank you. But I will comment on one thing. It's interesting because I inherited that project when I came to the foundation, and I will tell you that it certainly accomplished the things that Andrew just mentioned, but it was not easy because the model that it was using wasn't necessarily the most effective model for kids. But I think the lesson we learned is that you stay with something because the goal of that project was very, very important, working with transition age youth. But the lesson we learned is you have to stay with it over time because change comes slowly, and there's many obstacles and there's many challenges. But so you described a system that we all sort of know can be a bit difficult to work with, oftentimes risk adverse. Workers are oftentimes not prepared for the challenges that the young people bring them. So you've sort of created this thing called the Child Welfare Initiative. You're using philanthropic dollars. As a practical matter, how are you using those dollars to get sort of the change that you're looking for, the better outcomes for kids and families and youth? Can you give us some examples of how that might be working?
What we do is we engage a problem in child welfare, we're very careful about looking at it, examining its contours, examining where the funding is coming from, examining the folks who are contributing to that problem or working in that problem, and examining the results of it. And then very early on, making a determination as to whether it can be fixed, whether we have the capacity to fix it. And that's very important. And then sitting down with stakeholders, particularly, for example, the Department of Children and Family Services, with providers, and explaining to them that we see this problem, we understand this problem, learning more from this, and then offering up a solution. And what's key to that is offering up a solution that says to them, you know what? We can go ahead and we can correct this problem for you, and it will produce a benefit to you. So it will produce a benefit that allows you to more accurately and more, in a greater sense, fulfill your mission. Or what it'll do, it'll bring additional dollars to you, or it'll create efficiencies for you.
Give me an example.
So there are a few examples that I'd say. One example would be what we did with USC. And that was going to the USC Medical Hub. And again, hubs are facilities that are used to serve children in foster care. And sitting down and explaining to the medical hub that, you know what, there's this very large group, actually 45% of all children in foster care, that get very little attention. And these are kin care providers. These are grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles who have seen one of their relatives be taken into the foster care system and then voluntarily gone into that system, agreed to become foster parents, and agreed to take that child into their home. Now, if you look at the nature of these folks, they're heavily compromised in many ways. They're poor, they weren't expecting to do this, they have health problems, they're older, there are all sorts of things that make this hard for them. But they also prove to be one of the most stable placements and have one of the best long-term outcomes for them. One of the key areas that they have problems with, though, is getting their kids to the doctor. They have a real difficulty in finding docs who are willing to take their kids. They're all Medi-Cal eligible. And so it was about sitting down with USC and saying, let's take a look at the math. And if we want to serve this population, what would it take for you to, number one, hire sufficient staff, hire sufficient nurses' aides, hire sufficient nurses, doctors, whatever you need, right, to serve this group. And then as you did that, and as more kids from this group were being served by you with Medi-Cal dollars coming into them, at what point do you finally reach that tipping point where you have a large enough patient load so that it is now sustainable? So that you don't have to go back to a foundation and say, you know, we'd like some more money. Now, I'm not saying they won't, but that it's not a necessity to keep that going. Or another example I'd say would be if you take a look at something we did that's called Caroline Severance Manor. Housing is a real need around the foster care system, and it's a need that largely gets ignored, and it's very, very different from housing in the adult sense. Particularly when you're talking about housing in the foster care need, which you're really talking about in large part, what we focus on are services. So what this involved was going ahead and calling up the head of the Department of Children and Family Services, who's at the time Trish Plum, who's no longer there. And I said to Trish, you know what? There's a pot of money called MHSA dollars. These are mental health dollars. It's the millionaire's tax that's sitting out there. It's largely untapped. And if you gave Dr. Sutherland, who's the head of the Department of Mental Health, a call, we could develop a housing program that would be permanent supportive housing, and we could provide the supportive part of it. We could provide the services for you. First, Trish was very sweet, very kind, and she said, Andrew, you know, if there were dollars like that, I'd know it. And I said, oh, please, just go ahead and take a look. She took a look. She gave Dr. Sutherland a call. The two of them got together, and the result is Caroline Severance Manor, which is going to be opened up in 2014. It's going to serve children in the foster care system. It's 85 units. The largest units are going to be reserved for kin care families who have some of the greatest difficulties around housing. And I'll say it's one of the most interesting housing communities because it's the first in the state of California where the eligibility for it depends on the needs of the child. So the preference is don't go to the characteristics of an adult, but actually go to, are you caring for a child who had child welfare involvement? And are you caring for a child who has serious mental health needs? And then we'll go.
So great example. I'll give you a break here and explain the backstory on that too. Andrew, early on in his work, came to me and he wanted to talk to me about doing something about housing, knowing that the Weingart Foundation had done a lot of work there. He wanted some advice and some thoughts. And I said, Andrew, you don't know anything about housing. There are so many other things. I mean, I was actually rude, I'm sorry. There's so many other things you could be doing. Don't do this. And you never want to tell this guy he doesn't know something about something. So you know, what, 6 months later or 3 months later, whatever it is, he came back with the Carolyn Severance Manor solution. So interesting story. So anyway, I'm going to ask you, because I want to get to questions from our audience, but I want to ask you to sort of take a step back and just give us your sense of what direction you see foster care going in, sort of nationally, but I think everyone here is probably most interested in where it might be going in LA County. And given the fact that that's such a broad question, we need the Cliff Notes answer. Because I want to get to your
Take that as
question.
my cue. The Cliff Notes answer is that it's getting better. And it's getting better from a standpoint of the way that it's serving kids. There's far greater funding flexibility than there used to be. And in fact, a lot of that has to do with the 4E waiver that Fred mentioned. That means is that the department's no longer required to get federal funding to take children from their homes and then keep them in its care. It has a far greater level of flexibility around that. It is a department that is far more willing to engage with people who are interested in helping us. And that's a real difference. It's a real change in leadership. And so I think that reflects, just to go very quickly to the national change, is that there's been a shift in child welfare from ossified, monolithic, highly confidential, Sovietized bureaucracies that refuse to deal with other people to ones that are far more open and far more embracing of the community and far more embracing of entities that don't work directly within it and to form partnerships. And that's really critical, and particularly with philanthropy and the expertise that it has to offer.
So I want to turn to all of you now to see if this has generated any questions or some other topics that we've not touched on yet. So anyone have a first question? Yeah, John.
Brett, Andrew, thank you for sharing this. Thank you very much. John Cabar with the California Community Foundation. I guess what I'm interested in, you've touched on it. We look at LA County complex to everything we know about LA County. Go on your menu of things that are needing investments. Let's get down to the things that are happening in LA County. Opportunities that are right now that need investment, catalytic investment, that you think are, if completing those funding, if that funding will take you to the next step, continue this optimism, the shift in leadership. I say 3, you can say 5, you can say 2, whatever you think the current menu of opportunities for investment right now, in addition to funding CWI, but in terms of the opportunities to be catalytic and to have more model stories about philanthropy making a difference.
In terms of specific things, I think that what I'd say is, one, there are real opportunities, and they haven't largely been taken, but there are possibilities, and that is to improve the quality of the caregiver base and to change the way the Department of Children and
Could you
Families.
say that again?
To improve the quality. In other words, improve the capacity of foster care parents, improve their ability to care for those children, and to particularly for older youth, to continue to provide a sense of commitment to those older youth as they age out of care. That can be done. There are dollars to do that, and those dollars have largely remained in what is an existing system and an existing way of doing things, where if you changed it, You could go with a relatively small number of infusion of philanthropic dollars, would be able to attract an entirely different, more effective level of care providers, of foster homes, and improve the outcomes for children, and do it with an existing funding stream that's out there and that will support those families. Another area that I would pick is, and I mentioned it, is employment. Okay, if you look at the longitudinal results of kids who have jobs both before they're 18 and then kids after they reach 18, you see that everything works better. They're obviously less likely to be homeless, they're more likely to be in school, they're less likely to become pregnant, they're less likely to be involved in crime. Virtually every matrix gets better, right? And again, to go ahead and a small infusion of dollars that would allow existing funding streams to be accessed, and once those funding streams were accessed, would allow the players within that area, right? We're talking about service providers, we're talking about group homes, we're talking about foster homes, foster families, that would make the ability to go ahead and access funding. That exists, and you could do that, and virtually walk away from it in many ways. So,
This question back here.
Hi, Andrew, Chanel Boudikidis, CEO of 5 Acres.
yeah. Hey.
I'm wondering if you can also speak a little bit about...
Can you briefly mention what 5 Acres does?
Sure. So 5 Acres is...
Not the typical nonprofit speech, the short one.
Yes. So we service about 5,000 foster youth a year. We've been around for 125 years, so brief.
You did great.
And it ranges from inpatient to outpatient care. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, there's been a new term that's kind of been buzzing around called permanency. Mm-hmm. And I know that I recently went to a national conference where I heard a lot of other states doing things a little bit more innovatively than we have in California, specifically LA County, about efforts or funding towards permanency. And I'm wondering if that's something that has been kind of, especially since we have a lot of foundations here, if that's a term that is even familiar for those looking for opportunities to fund.
Permanency is, just to explain what that means, and it's interesting because it means entirely different things if you go into housing, if you go into child welfare. You've got almost diametrically opposed definitions.
It's not on your sheet.
It's not on the sheet. So thank you. Permanency generally within the child welfare arena refers to when a child has left foster care and has been placed in a permanent home, a permanent family. So what that means is that a child has left foster care to be reunited with their parent of origin. They've left foster care to be adopted, right? Or they've left foster care, and this is where it gets to, there are debates, and I don't think we really have time for this, but where they go under guardianship of a relative, and there are debates about whether that actually qualifies as permanency and whether, you know, placement with grandma versus placement with mom really means that. But it's that, those are the key areas around that, and it's the area that where that struggles the most. And I think why we struggle with that and why we see that as the most effective option is because it's a recognition that one of the worst things that we do is raise kids in state care, and that the longer a child remains in state care, the more likely that child is to be hurt, the less likely that child is to go on to college, the less likely they are going to be graduating from high school, be employed, the more likely they are going to be of color. And so virtually on every matrix, the longer that child stays in care, you know that the results are going to get harder and harder and harder for that kid. So there's a desire to create that permanency, which is really a stable exit from foster care, as quickly and as early as possible. Did that?
Chanel, a comment on that?
One of the interesting things that, you know, I think for service providers is our contracts, you know, obviously we're all very heavily government funded. Basically, we are very good at being contract compliant. And I think philanthropy has played the role that I think you guys mentioned, doing the above and beyond what we're currently being funded for by the government. And in respect to permanency, and the reason why I brought it up was, I'm hearing from other states that there are things programmatically that organizations can do to try to bring permanency to a foster child if it works, such as family finding or targeted recruitment, things like that. And I know that just among me and some of my peer organizations, when we talk about that, it's a hard area to find funding for. But it's, just a piece that I think is very new, kind of like a buzz that's going around in LA County.
Can I just
Sure.
say one thing where I think there's actually a really important role with philanthropy, and that is where philanthropy is able to, because there are a lot of dollars that go into that, and where philanthropy can go ahead and fund efforts, for example, to work with county officials to point out that the outcomes on those contracts that you're getting from LA, right, that those outcomes don't actually match your ability to do individualized case planning to get them to the goals that they're trying to get to. And that if we went ahead and did that, we'd have a more effective service. Again, we'd be able to lock onto a funding stream that already exists, and we'd have an outcome that worked better for kids.
Yeah, question, up in front.
Yeah, I have two questions, actually. One, in the philanthropy world, in the philanthropy world, there is and has been quite a push and a lot of conversation about evidence-based programming and looking for evidence-based models to fund, so you really leverage your investment. But there is a huge tension between looking for an evidence-based model and looking for an innovative pilot to fund something new to try and get something going and then walk away in your word. So I'd like you to address that tension for us, because I think it's important. And then the other thing I'd like you to address, if you could, is it's my understanding, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that infants and toddlers are not only the largest growing sector in our foster care system here, but also are the greatest number here in LA County over the last few years. And if you could address a little bit of your conversation around that arena and what types of solutions that you would point us to in that area.
Okay.
You want to take the infants one first?
Yeah, I want to take the infants one first. Actually,
Everyone get the question? Yep.
the numbers are a little different than that. If you look at the numbers, they actually skew a little older. And actually, I'm going to call on Min's son Maker, because we were just talking about those numbers. Min, do you remember the numbers that we were talking about? They're actually in the glossary at first, and we cut them out. So, Min's son is Senior Policy Director at CWI.
Yes, so I think when we were looking at the numbers of kids in care, it's actually infants like 0 to under the age of 5 actually do make up a pretty large proportion of kids in foster care, but the next biggest group are transition age youth, so older youth in care, ages 14 and older. But you're correct, infants and toddlers are a very fast-growing population within the child welfare system.
And then, of course, it depends on how you're going to...
20% of the total.
So, and then it depends on how you're going to... Are you going to take the median? That sort of thing.
The reason
So,
I hear,
yeah.
because developmentally, their brains are impacted so differently by the change in the trauma, and so it would be really useful to
Go
know
ahead.
what
No,
solution.
I was going to say, I think that, and that's an area where I think philanthropy has taken a real lead. I think that that's an area where there's attention to that group in a way that there hasn't been before. I think, for example, if you took a look in a very concrete way, the way Los Angeles has moved from group home care in the last 10 years, or if you went back to '99, for example, you'd find far larger numbers of very young kids in care when you're looking at group home care of up to 20,000 kids. Now it's fallen down to 1,000, right? And so while you still find some very, very young kids, I think the practice changed as a result of the intervention of philanthropy, and so that this is not serving these kids most effectively. So,
What about the tension between the project where you're essentially replicating proven practice versus the new project for which the data is not clear in terms of efficacy? Any thoughts on that? That might be a question for some of our colleagues in the, to me, I'll give Andrew a break on this. I think, for me, it's a matter of, sometimes in philanthropy, we have to take reasonable risk. We have to be willing to step out on a project that, where the evidence, the efficacy may not be proven, but it's reasonable, it's a thoughtful approach, it's based on other collateral approaches, and you take the risk with your funding. Would invite other colleagues if they want to add to that. So, yes, Rona. Wait, Rona, let's wait for the microphone.
Well, I think it also depends very much on the mission of the foundation, and especially if you have a living donor or if you have a very hands-on board, what their risk tolerance is and
Yes.
what their feelings are. So there might be foundations that are more eager to do risky projects and pilots and seed funding of things, and others where it's a more traditional approach.
I'm looking at my friend, Mike, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but Mike Ruane is here from the Children and Family Commission in Orange County. And Mike, I know you're involved in projects that are cutting edge, but you've got a public body that's paying close attention to what you're doing. So how do you reconcile that issue?
Thanks for not putting me on the
Yeah,
spot.
no problem. We're going to talk, go ahead.
I think I would say another, clearly in health and evidence-based practices, are the dominant strategy.
Right.
This field, I think you don't have as many evidence-based as a practical matter, and I think it's an area that there's been rapid shifts and improvement. So I don't know that general rule should apply in the child welfare arena. It's dynamic, it's changing at both the federal and state level, and I think it's a time for reasonable pioneers, not not always taking things that work to scale. That's been our experience in this area.
So you've got the mic in your hand. Were you getting ready to ask another question, or did I misinterpret that?
I guess I will. I was wondering, one of the things in Southern California in particular, the rapid, as Dal and others at USC have kept, the population growth hasn't been as explosive as the shift within the population. I was wondering if Andrew has some, insights on how the changing demographics culturally is affecting, these are issues that family means different things in different cultures, and grandparents raising their grandchildren in certain communities is a natural thing, and others it's not. So I don't know how you've seen the landscape, because the last 10 years have actually been fairly dynamic in Los Angeles and Southern California.
Yeah, I think that there's the recognition of those difficulties, the serious recognition of those difficulties began in, I think, probably around the mid-90s, and then have increased. And I think there was a recognition that, for example, certain populations were more inclined to adopt versus other populations that were more comfortable with guardianship, and that certain populations may be more inclined, or individuals, and I hate to talk with these generalizations because they ultimately don't work, but that they may be less inclined to go ahead and move against a relative and demand the termination of their parental rights. But I think that it goes to, I think part of your question goes to the broader issue, and that is the issue of disproportionality and the impact of race on child welfare systems. And so when you take a look at the percentages of kids in the child welfare system, and then on a racial level, and then take a look at the numbers of kids who are detained and then how long they stay in the system. Let's take African Americans. African Americans are 8% of the population. Is that a fair guess? But in most systems, you'd see that that their children are taken into care somewhere around, they occupy maybe 50% of the overall child welfare population. And then you see that that African American children stay longer in those systems. You see that they're more likely to be in congregate care as opposed to individual care. And you see a whole series of outcomes that consistently get worse and worse. And I don't think that we've really actually found the answer to that. I mean, in some ways, I think there is a need to understand communities, and in many ways that's something that departments have struggled with, is to actually understand the families and the children whom they're designed to serve. As I sometimes say, it's very difficult for these departments to do that. I don't know any human being who is relieved or appreciates the fact when their neighbor knocks on the door and says, hey, I noticed you've been having some problems with your child, so I'm going to call the Department of Children and Family Services, and they'll be on by. That's generally not thought of as a helping hand. And in some ways it's funny, and in other ways it leads to very tragic results, because it means neighbors don't call and families don't reach out. So I think that these are issues that have existed for a very long time. And I will say, for example, if you want to just talk about race, the worst, and I always point this out, the area that is really impacted in this and that receives so little support, quite frankly, are Native Americans. When you look at that group, that's astounding. And so I think it's this need to look within those high-risk groups and see what happens. I want to add also another group, and this is just because I was thinking about it only because we exchanged some emails yesterday, and this is with the Hilton Foundation, and that was the identification of some groups that I don't think have received a lot of attention, and I think through their work is going to really provide the sort of impetus to have governments and to have agencies within child welfare pay a lot of attention to this and really ignite that kind of catalyzing change. And one of them I'll say are parent impregnating teens, particularly on the prevention side, for example. We tend to do we have lots of programs that help once kids are pregnant but don't do a lot to prevent pregnancy. I think one of the real issues, for example, and when I read the Culhane report that you spent a great deal of time on, was the issue of crossover youth. And those are youth that move from one system to another. And when you look at the results, the long-term results of those youth, I have to say that, I've been doing this work now for 17 years. When I read that report, those numbers were astounding in terms of how phenomenally poor and tragic those lives were and how desperately those lives needed to have attention, and that they're not getting that level of attention right now. So those are the sorts of things.
Yes, Carol.
I have a more practical question on the crossover and what you were talking about with respect to helping the families that are actually fostering the youth. Have you noticed an interest in the county agencies more now with respect to co-location of services? Because oftentimes you have families where they have a foster kid that's in DCFS, needs DMH, their probation, they're getting wraparound. Sometimes they have other services they need, and you already have families that are stressed, and they're having to go hither, thither, and yon to try to get these services for the kids. Have you seen an interest in bringing everything together so the families have one place to go with other services that they can get to help them, like the teen pregnancy or the other things that would help them as a family? But the county in the past hasn't seemed to want to do that.
Does everyone know co-location of services?
Sorry.
That basically is the desire to bring as many services as possible in Los Angeles, geography and those sorts of things, into one place. And that has been a difficult issue. I think one of the biggest examples of co-location of services that you have, one of the most active ones, are the creation of the medical hubs that I was talking about earlier. And some of those hubs do very well, some of them don't. If you look across, some of them have, for example, dental services, others have none. Some of them provide mental health services, others provide none. Some of them provide help for kin care families, others provide limited help. I think that what hasn't happened, and I think this is where, for example, again, it's extremely difficult for a department to go ahead and pull back and examine the way it's providing those services, because it operates within these programs, within these funding constraints, and see how it is that they can actually improve those programs. So are the hubs actually working in the way that we'd like them to work? And are we using those dollars
how
in the
does
way we should?
philanthropy impact that?
Well,
That's a good example, but how does philanthropy impact that?
Well, I think that, for example, what philanthropy takes a look at is, I'll use it again because it's important, crossover youth. How many crossover youth access those services? Very, very few. Highly excluded populations generally. If you take a look at, for example, transition age youth, so particularly those over 18, and you look at those youth who are at the highest risk, how many of those actually access services, housing services and supportive services that are for transition age youth? These are in many ways co-located services. They're concentrated, they're in a single area, you can spot them out on the map, right? But the truth of it is, if you look at those high risk kids, those kids that, and I'm going to get on a soapbox, but I got to say, those kids for whom those programs were originally passed by the California legislature and the United States Congress, and whom were very willing to put their picture up, but when we finally get it down to the county level, we don't serve them. But there's an answer to that. It's not just a matter of walking away. The truth is, if you take a look at that problem, what you see is a lot of it has to do with the funding requirements that have been placed on county contracts that demand results from places such as you and that are unreasonable and mean that service providers who are supposed to help those kids can't help those kids because they know they'll never meet the requirements that have been imposed upon them by the county.
So this becomes an example where maybe philanthropy with a very thoughtful and targeted grant that demonstrates what's possible can have some possible impact. Is that what you're
Absolutely,
saying?
absolutely.
Okay. Yes. You know what, I'm a former teacher, and I found out to my great dismay once that all of my bad students were on the left side of the room, and I'm doing it again. So Eileen, I'm going to come back to you. So,
Eileen Adams, Deputy Mayor, Office of Strategic Partnerships. Andrew, could you talk a little bit about the role that schools have in a paradigm shift related to foster youth? What positive role could they play in, for example, connecting these youth more to after-school programs? How well are our schools equipped to interact with these youth and their families in positive ways?
Well, I think the honest answer to that is if you look at the results that you get out of these schools, they're very poor. And I suppose just on a personal level, what I can say is what I often say, the LAUSD that I went to school in doesn't exist anymore. And the opportunities that existed then simply aren't there. I think that there's a very complex problem. I think that both child welfare and foster care have responded very poorly to that, and largely because they've reacted out of existing structures and don't know how to tackle the problem in an effective way. So I'll take it on the child welfare side, okay? And approach school from that, because that's the side that I know best, all right? If you take a look at where most foster children in Los Angeles County attend school, they attend very large urban schools. Schools that are very difficult for a kid in or out of foster care to get a good education, and we know that. We know the challenges that they place. If you went ahead, though, and you took a look at what individual in a 16, 17, 18-year-old's life plays the most important role in making sure that a kid is going to get the most that he or she can in that environment, that's something that we have control over, okay? Who's that going to be? It's going to be their foster parent. It's going to be the kid. It's going to be the person that puts that kid to bed and wakes him or her up in the morning, that gets that report card and takes a look, that can sit and ask that kid, what is it you want to do? How do you feel about that course? Do you like that teacher? Who can go down to that school and say, you know what, this kid needs help over here? Who can, frankly, show up to the Edelman Court when there's transitional planning that's going on and say, you know what, we'd like you to take part in this. And I think that this is about philanthropy going ahead and taking a look and saying, how do we change and take a look, how do we change this, the way we're implementing this funding stream? It's an ongoing permanent flood of dollars that are going out there, and the truth is we're not using it effectively. And if we went ahead and revised the foster caregiver program and said if you approached families in a different way and took a look at where you're going to find those families, you'd probably end up with different results. And if you approach them with a different set of expectations, this is what we expect you to do,
so
you'd end up with different
demonstrating
results.
what's possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jackie Castor, Every Child Foundation.
Thanks, Jackie.
And I had a question about any wrinkles that have appeared in the implementation of AB 12 and if there's a role that philanthropy can play in that.
An AB 12 extended foster care from 18 to 21 under certain conditions. So it's in your cheat sheet.
Yeah. AB 12 went into effect in January, so I want we have to kind of give it a pass. It's a very, very new program. I think there are issues of great concern around it. I think that AB 12 has struggled with determining what outcomes we want out of it. It was a law that was passed without a clear set of outcomes for youth who were going to take part in it. And I think that in the implementation of those outcomes that finally came, we ended up, and this goes to looking at best practices and looking at policies, we sometimes ended up we struggled with not looking at best practices and what ensure the best outcomes for kids, but often personal values got in the way. One of the areas that I will say, for example, and I'm proud of this as far as AB 12 that we did some work on, because it is such a need, and that is, it had already been passed once CWI got into existence, and that there were lots of stakeholders and lots of people who had a real justifiable sense of ownership, and frankly knew a lot more about it than we did. They'd been working on it for years. But when we took a look at that, and tried to see where it was we could contribute, there was one area where we could, and we're hoping that because this was potentially a major problem with AB 12, and that is, what do you do with those kids, those high-risk former foster youth, right, who we have at group homes, right? Largely they're in group homes, and we know they're just not going to do well. You can look at the numbers. That's where the largest number of homeless kids come from. Those are the ones that if you ask providers, they say, we'd like to have them into our TAY programs, but we know they're just not going to be able to meet the requirements that we need to meet for our county contracts. So what do you do with those kids who have mental disabilities and behavioral disorders, for example, but that aren't going to qualify for SSI? And we know, quite frankly, if we took an honest look at them, they're not going to be able to meet the employment requirements that have been set forth. They're going to have real trouble meeting the educational requirements that are set forth, and they're in desperate need. And so we carved out an area where it said, if you take a look at the medical, there's a medical condition that's attached to that not a lot of folks were paying attention to, and that was, if you define that in a way so that it's able to meet that kid at Hathaway Sycamores or 5 Acres, or those kids with high mental health needs, that buys them some time, because the truth is this is a big hole in our overall social fabric, those people that have these needs that don't qualify for SSI but will struggle for all of their lives. But still, that are going to be able, despite the fact that they're not going to be able to meet those other requirements, we're going to be able to keep them off the street and to provide them the level of support that they can because they have these mental disabilities. I think that the department has struggled. I think the courts have struggled in ensuring that every kid receives the appropriate level of planning for AB 12. I think that it's struggled training social workers. I think all of these are areas that have been very, very difficult. So, but largely, I think the jury's out on it. I don't think it's come back in. Did you sort of?
Yes, Celia.
Hi, Andrew. I wanted to get a little more specific around your idea around caregiver training. I mean, it sounds great, but what specifically do you see the changes that could be made? And this is from someone who came from that world, actually, of training foster and adoptive parents. So I want to hear exactly who the average caregiver is now, and what kind of changes do you see based on some of your ideas?
Yeah. It's interesting. There's not been a whole lot of work that examines the characteristics of caregivers. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, there's only been one study that took a look at who these people are, and it was based on the 2000 census, and it was done by the Stewart Foundation. So, another example of philanthropy that said, we don't know who these people are. We know what we say about them, but we don't know who they are. When that analysis was undertaken, it found a number of really serious challenges within that group. It found that foster care providers, I'm talking about unrelated foster care providers in this case, unrelated foster parents, so what we think of as a typical foster parent, largely headed household compared to their other households with other children. Okay, so they're non-foster parenting peers, so that makes sense, right? So households that had kids that didn't have foster children. So if you looked at those households with foster children, you found that they were larger. You found that they were more likely to have one spouse or that didn't go to college. You were more likely to find that there was one spouse at least who had been on public assistance in the last year. You found that there was a substantially higher ratio of children to adults than other households, right? And so you found a far greater number of challenges that don't exist in the other communities. So I think that where that puts us today is, one, we need to take a look at the caregiver pool that we have, particularly when you take a look at the fact that the number of kids in care has fallen so dramatically. And you can interpret that in any number of ways, but interpreting it in a way that says, you know what we've done is we've taken kids who don't need to be in foster care, and we now have a much higher need group of kids who are actually in care. And we need to take a look at whether that caregiver pool is capable of meeting these needs, okay? So, to go even more specifically, I think it's about taking a look at communities, and we've done actually focus groups in this area, right? Where we've asked folks like 5 Acres and other entities to identify for us, would you please go ahead and give us your foster parents who you regard as the best. Now the key to that is not, there's an answer that you want from that, and there's an answer you don't want from it. The answer you don't want from that, don't give us your foster parents that always say yes, okay? We want your foster parents that you'd place your own kids in, okay? And we had focus groups with those folks. And we asked them, why do you become foster parents? First of all, I want to say none of them said the money. Not a single one. Secondly, when you did ask them, they talked about reasons of faith. They talked about a desire to do good. They talked about a fundamental concern for children. They talked about the things that we'd really want to hear them talk about, right? But then when you said, what is so frustrating about being a foster parent? In some cases, there were some folks who'd left. Why did you leave? And what they said was, well, we don't feel like we're part of the operation. We have folks who come into our home, who visit this child, they sit in our living room, we're not in the room, they make decisions, they have discussions, and then they leave. We don't feel integrated into this process. And we don't know what's going on in this kid's life. Is there any way that we can change that? Because if we change that, we'd be more likely to stay.
So I'm sitting here thinking that some of my colleagues in the audience might hear an answer like that and say, well, we go out, so Philanthropy pays out to conduct some of these focus groups, and we discover this information. We feed it back to the system. Is anyone listening? Is there any indication that it's going to make any difference?
I can answer that question. What it was, this is just, well, I'll tell you CWI, and I know this is not about CWI, and I don't want it to be about CWI. I genuinely don't. It's not the place. But what we did was we sat down with a group of the largest FFA providers in the county, and we said, you know what, we can identify problems within the way you're dealing with this parent, within your FFA, within your foster family agencies. These are foster families that private agencies run as opposed to being directly run by the department. We can identify practices that you have implemented and that are making your foster parents less likely to stay and less likely to perform, less likely to provide the kind of caregiving that you want. So we'll make a deal, okay? If you go ahead and you agree to change those practices, you agree to go ahead and more fully integrate your foster parents in the determination of your policies and how you're going to deal with them and how you're going to do your case planning. You go ahead and you deal with them in a way that's going to allow them so that there's greater respite care opportunities. And when I mean respite care, I'm not talking about that week-long thing. I'm talking about even down to babysitting. And if you agree that cross-agency, you'll go ahead and you'll do that because you can do it across agencies. If you agree to take on those reforms and others, then what we'll do is we'll go ahead in return, we'll recruit these parents for you. In this case, they're parents that are designed to serve kids with mental disabilities, about 50% of them who serve older youth. We'll go ahead and we'll recruit those families and we'll provide them to you. And the truth is those families are ones that you've been looking for, they provide an income stream, and they help you fulfill your mission. And at the end of the day, I don't know if I said this, if you look at the county for those families, there's a $12 million pot of money that's sitting there waiting to be tapped to support those families. Did that answer it? Did that come close? It's a big question.
I want to, unfortunately, I know there's some more hands up and we're coming to sort of the end of our time here. So I want to thank you, Andrew. For me, what I've heard is, again, thoughts about this large system, more flexibility than we've seen before, so some opportunity here. There is a role for philanthropy. I like to call it demonstrating in a thoughtful, sort of targeted way what's possible, and hoping that those changes are replicated going forward into policy and practice. So that's the hope. I wanted to sort of take the prerogative of the moderator here, and I wanted to share one. Andrew and I have been talking for a number of years about a question that is, I know, of great interest to him and great interest to me, and I wanted to sort of end here. You know, in my former life, I worked with you know, literally thousands of street kids. And I used to sit back at night and wonder, why did this kid make it and those kids not? I got sort of another example of that the other day. I got a phone call. My executive assistant, Priscilla, who some of you know, came in and said, there's this person on the phone, and I said, I just sort of knew. Got on the phone, and this was a former kid that I knew when I was at foster care, when I was at Covenant House. This kid had been essentially prostituted by her mother to support her drug habit when she was about 10 years old. This kid was in and out of care. This kid had every substance abuse problem known to me. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on about the challenges. And she's now calling me as an adult and saying, I'm doing fine. Okay, I'm doing fine. And so, again, I went back to that question of, so how come? Why her and why not so many other kids that I still think about a lot? Andrew, you must think about that question a lot, because you're one of these examples of somebody who, you know, who overcame some things. And so what is it in your own life, in your experience in working with kids, what is it that we can point to? Is it this thing we call resiliency? What is it?
With respect to myself, I have to say that that's a question that I've gotten for a long time, and that for a very long time I had a lot of trouble answering. And perhaps the easiest way to explain it is I probably didn't know the answer to them myself. When I think about it and look about it with time and age, I think that part of it is resiliency. And
Resiliency.
yeah.
And so what does that mean?
Well, I think that in my own case, when I look at the picture of that little boy, that little boy, there's something in him that just wasn't going to give up. And maybe some of you know that today from this adult. But, and that can be good and that can be bad. Beyond that, though, I think that that resiliency was met with opportunity. That I wasn't moved multiple times. We had a question from Eileen about school. I attended LAUSD when it was a place where a kid like me and where kids in foster care today wouldn't have faced the challenges that they faced. I went to El Camino out in the valley. I stayed in one home. It wasn't a great home, but it was one home. And it meant that I knew where I was going to wake up and where I was going to go to bed. And I may not have had a relationship with my parents, but I knew that it was safe. And so I think that it's about providing where we can work on. I'd like to see us work toward establishing those senses of safety and opportunity, and also looking at this system and saying, why would we ever, I think some of you have heard me say this before, yes, resiliency is important, but why would we ever create a system that by and large demands that level of resiliency of a child in order to succeed? And at the end of the day, the truth of it is, if we take and we bore down into things that provide those opportunities, we don't need to, and we can fix it.
Good. Well, I want to thank everyone for their time today and your great questions. I think at least I've heard, and I hope you've heard some things that are actionable that we can work on. I want to recognize, by the way, before we get out of here, the recent work and the opportunity that's coming by way of the Hilton Foundation. And Ed, I know you're here, and Janine, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. The Hilton Foundation has announced a rather large and impressive initiative focused on foster care. And so, Janine, I'm sure, if you want to wave your hand for people who don't know you, can tell you more about that, and I think there's probably information on the website. So it's another example of philanthropy stepping up in a really significant way and doing something about, I think, an issue that we all care deeply about. So I want to thank you, Andrew. I want to thank you for your time today, and I'm going away in a couple weeks, and I'll see you after the first of the year. Bye-bye.